Have you ever felt lost? I don't mean lost like in a new city or you're taking a walk and you take a detour where you're not supposed to. I mean lost. Feeling helpless, utterly and completely lost. 4 years ago, in 2019, I lost myself totally. The very essence of who I thought I was as a human being was shaken to the point that I didn't think I would recover and find myself back. My mother, whom I did not expect to die, died. Like many women, my mother was a very strong, resilient single mom, a strong and loving Black woman who was my rock. She made my life make sense. She was my home. She was my anchor. When the world beat me, she was my one sure space to go to find myself. And in an instant, that was taken away from me. Many people have lost their moms and they describe the pain differently because the feeling of loss or grief we express differently because of our backgrounds or what we're exposed to. But for me, the worst after effect feeling of losing my mother was a deep, deep sense of being lost. I felt as if I was a dirty, old, crumpled little paper floating around, being rained on, being stepped on, with no home, with no safety, with nowhere to go to have my back covered. Every day, I would go to bed and I'd wake up thinking, when I woke up, the feeling would go away because I'm strong, I'm Stacey. It never did. It stayed with me so much so that it started to rip up the core of who I am as a person. I had lost myself. I had lost my campus. I had lost the foundation on which I had built myself up until that time. I hated it. I absolutely hated it because in one of my definitions, I love control. I used to love it when I thought I had it, but I lost it. And so the feeling of being lost made me lose control, and that really challenged again the core of who I am as a person. And that experience made me become desperate. I was extremely desperate to feel found, to feel like I belong, to feel myself again. And so my constant question was how? How do I get back to myself? How do I get back to the Stacey that wakes up joyful and is purposeful and knows what they're doing and is very clear about what's going on in their life and their journey? How? How do I bridge back to self? Self, the home and the anchor of my being, of my hopes and my dreams. I talk about self because self is a very, very important foundation for anything we hope to build. What happens when we lose self? Is there a path to get back to self? Is there, like Lynn, a recipe? Is there a cue word that I can use to instantly find self? Perhaps is there a bridge that helps you get back to self? Looking back now, having hated the process of losing myself, and I almost could kick myself for saying this, but I'm glad I went through it because in losing self, I found a better version of me. I found a vulnerable yet strong version of who I am. So who is self and why is it important for us to find self? Self is the place from which everything else emanates. Self is your internal campus. Self is the foundation. It's your building block. And yet, self can also get lost. Self can lose hope. Self can get it wrong. So the question is, how do we get back to self? When self is lost, we become disconnected. We lose our sense of identity, our sense of purpose, our sense of direction. We need to find our way back to self. We need a bridge back to self. And so what is the purpose of a bridge? A bridge implies that there are two areas that need to be connected, right? A bridge implies that there is value in connecting these two places. And it means that without connecting these two places, their value or their usefulness is limited. I'll give you an example. I grew up in Livingstone in Zambia, which houses the mighty Victoria Falls. Zimbabwe will say it's in Zimbabwe. I still argue it's in Zambia, but the jury's still out on that. But there is a bridge that connects those two countries. The way that the falls is set up, there's a part of it you can only experience in Zambia, and there's a part of it you can only experience in Zimbabwe. There's no way you can see the falls the same way in the same place. And so there was two areas of value that needed to be connected. Without that bridge, we would not have a tourist population or industry or sector that drives and creates jobs the way that it does for that area. And so even as we explore building bridges even with others, the bridge to self serves as a very, very fundamental block. When my mommy died, I tried lots of ways to cope. It was difficult because there's no prescription to grief, right? You're not told on day one, you will think of this and you will react like that. You're not told on day two, it's gonna come crumbling down. It got so bad, I had to consider going for grief therapy. And I'm so glad I did. Because in going through therapy, my therapist reminded me asked me to think of the beautiful things that describe my mother. And I remembered that she loved plants. And when my husband and I had our firstborn son, my mother came to visit us and she planted me a moringa tree. I had completely forgotten about it. It was old, dry, because I don't have green fingers. So my therapist encouraged me to build a garden around the moringa tree and create a place where I could be by myself, feel my feelings, and figure out a way to get back to me. I didn't know that my mother's moringa tree and my garden were the bridge back to myself that I so desperately needed. And so you too, when lost, need to find your bridge, your way to get back to your real person, your real you, the core of who you are. Otherwise, you're left feeling lost, empty, with no purpose, creating empty spaces that in us don't help us map the way forward. For me, it was this terrible loss that exposed the space that existed between who I was and who I could be. For others, it could be divorce, it could be hurt, it could be financial turmoil that unravels the insecurities and fear that come with the emptiness of not knowing. A bridge becomes useful because it connects two areas that must be brought together. It's in between these points that there's an empty space that carries uncertainty, yet also hope for what is to come. For most of us, especially women, the two extremes that must be connected are normally the ability or the grace to accept the now, to accept today, and yet still hold up hope for tomorrow without being drowned by either one of them. It is the realization that connecting these two and allowing them to coexist is what makes for a strong foundation on which a bridge can stand. And so I look back, many times I spent time in my garden, overlooking my mother's moringa tree, allowing myself to feel emotion, which 90% of the time took me to a really sad place. But I managed to do three things: to accept, to find, and to move. I had to accept that my mother was gone. And that changed my reality in a lot of ways. The feeling of loss is unbearable. And the reason acceptance is important is because you acknowledge the place where you are. You say, this is what I'm feeling. And in acceptance, it allows you the grace to say, okay, where to from here? It changes your mental faculty after admitting or accepting where you are. And because loss invokes a deep sense of desperation and fear and vulnerability, acceptance is the last thing you want to do, because it means you're accepting that you're vulnerable and you're desperate and you're scared. But in acceptance lies the power to fully be present wherever you are and ask yourself, where am I going to after this? Number 2, to find, where did you lose self? Where did the disconnect happen? Where was the last place you felt safe? And why is that place not safe anymore? What took that safety away? Lastly, to move. How do I bridge back? How do I go back to where it went wrong and build to where I could be? In fact, when I think about what loss truly means, it is actually the feeling of being one thing or being in a certain space and not knowing how to get to the other side. That's what loss is. That is the place I was in for 2 years before I sought help in therapy. I didn't like the place where I was, but most importantly, I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. And so with moving, you find a better and a safer version of you. And yet to move to the other side requires you to embrace the now. And yet stretching and reaching out to the other side. This could also mean growth. It could mean expansion, because for you to stretch out requires you to move in some way. Expansion could mean expanding your heart to be gracious to yourself. The permission to feel the present, and yet also hang on to the little, almost extinguished flickering light guiding you to better. Expansion could mean expanding your heart to forgive and let go so you can receive love from yourself and from others. Expanding could be expanding your mind on where the help could come from. But whatever it takes to find your feet and to start to put one in front of another. As you notice all of these tools positioned around you, slowly strength comes back. Slowly your feet begin to garner strength and hope springs forth, energizing you to put one little foot out in faith. Most times we don't even know what lies beyond the first step, but your spirit knows it. The path appears with each shaking yet determined step towards the light. Maybe it's new realities, maybe it's new opportunities, maybe it's new awareness that lie beyond the horizons. Whatever the case, it is always, always, I repeat, always worth bridging back to yourself and connect two valuable treasures, your current self and your future self. And by bridging back to yourself, you give others the permission to do so. Thank you.